Guys, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about cognition or Unit 5. This video is going to be a little bit longer because cognition is the unit that takes up the biggest bulk of content on the AP exam out of all the units. So we're going to spend a little extra time on it and really hammer things down. But we're going to spend 2 full days on it, so you have 2 days to watch this and take all your notes. So let's break down what cognition is. Cognition, I said, is just kind of thinking and mental processes. And the biggest one we talk about is memory, but it also connects to kind of decision making and things like schemas, thinking with mental sets, and functional fixedness. Language, I'm not going to talk about here, but we talk about in the developmental unit, and then intelligence. So, the definition of memory is just the indication that learning has persisted over time. And this happens in kind of a 3-step process, which we call the information processing model. That includes encoding, storage, and then retrieval. So I have all these nice graphic organizers here, so let's break it down. It's called the information processing model, and you can think of that as like information, IT. It's kind of like a computer analogy in how our brain works with memory. So our first step in the information processing model is encoding. And this is just noticing information to get it to even kind of start that process of storing it as a memory. So it's noticing, paying attention to it to be able to even store it into our long-term memory. And one of the ways we do this is through rehearsal. And rehearsal is just kind of a strategy that we use, or different strategies that we use to get information into our memory system. So, one example that we're going to talk about later is kind of like repeating a phone number over and over to try and, just get it into that memory system to then, work on it more in your working memory and store it. So, encoding is just like a keyboard, just kind of getting it in to that computer system. Then we have storage, and storage is now it's in there. You've paid attention to it. Now you have to save it and put it away. So storage is just like the save icon. You're saving it and then trying to get it into long-term memory so it's lasting, enduring, and permanent. And then retrieval is the act of, now it's in your files. It's cool. It's all saved away. You went a while without accessing it. And retrieval is just the clicking open your document. So you're pulling it out from your filing cabinet in storage and accessing it again. And then kind of underneath this, there's a little bit of a different model of memory. So we just talked about information processing model. Another one is called Baddeley and Hitches. These are 2 psychologists that came up with their little model of how memory works, kind of a 3-step process that's been added to over time. So what they have first is they say you go through sensory memory. So what happens here is, again, sensory memory is just a fleeting kind of instant memory that's only just a second or 2 long of kind of sensory information. So you haven't even really processed it or put any thought into it. It's just a very fleeting, like 1 second, what's going on in this very current moment. So iconic is just that brief, current, fleeting visual memory that's going on in your current moment. And then echoic is just auditory, that very brief auditory thing. The echoic's a little bit longer than visual, which makes sense when you think about if you're trying to remember a phone number or something. You might say it out loud because it lasts a little bit longer that way. Iconic you can remember because iconic, I, and then echoic, you think echo, echo, echo in your ear. Short-term memory is that's where kind of it's your mental workspace. So they call it short-term memory and then changed it kind of to working memory because it's where you're kind of currently processing and thinking about things. It's your mental workbench. It's where all your current thoughts are taking place. And you can't be thinking about too many things at once. We talked about in sensation and perception, we're not very good multitaskers. So our capacity, how much it holds, is only 7 plus or minus a couple things. And the duration is relatively short too. So if you think about trying to remember a phone number and get it into long-term memory, you have a really short, couple second window in which you can do that, right? So it's like 15 to 30 seconds. And then we have retrieval, we said. Then we have long-term memory. Once it goes from short-term memory, we then store it in our long-term memory, where the capacity, how much it holds, is unlimited. You can fit a bajillion million memories in your long-term memory. And the duration of how long it lasts is unlimited. So you can fit bajillions of memories in there for however long you want. So it's in there forever. We said that the problem comes in just retrieving it, and that sometimes there's issues blocking our ability to access our memories. So let's break down now the different divisions of our long-term memory. So the two main overarching ones are automatic and effortful processing. Automatic, you can think back to like autonomic nervous system. It's something that you can't control, that's kind of unconscious stuff. So you're not consciously thinking about it. It just kind of happens. So within this is implicit, and you can just think implicit means unconscious. And within the category of implicit comes procedural motor skills. And this is the most important one to know out of these two underneath it. Procedural motor skills procedural is just your motor skills, like knowing how to ride a bike or knowing how to tie your shoe or knowing how to walk, whatever. It's kind of skill-based. And think about it. Automatic, it's something that you don't have to think about. Like when you're walking up the stairs, when you're riding a bike, when you're just going for a run, you're not thinking about how to coordinate your limbs and all that stuff. Maybe when you're learning, you do, but once you have these in your memory, you don't have to think about them anymore. It's automatic and implicit, like internal. You don't have to put any effortful processing into it. And then classically conditioned associations, think back to learning unit. Obviously, those are implicit and automatic in that your fear reaction to something or your classically conditioned association, you're not, it's an involuntary behavior. You're not consciously thinking about it. And these are controlled from the cerebellum. And that makes sense because remember, cerebellum, it's all about motor skill movements. So cerebellum controls our automatic implicit memories like procedural ones. Then we have effortful processing. And these are all the things that obviously it's in the name. Effortful. You have to put thought into to remember it. You have to consciously be thinking about it. And the two categories within this would be semantic, so facts, so knowing the capitals, studying for a test. All that stuff is kind of fact-based, knowing your birthday. Then, a way we said to remember this is semantic. You can think cement. If it's a fact, it is the truth, hopefully. It's the truth, so it's cement. It's in there. Episodic, you can think it's like an episode of a TV show. It's an episode, an event. So episodic is like events or experiences, like remembering your first birthday, or because of infantile amnesia, you might not remember your first birthday, but remembering your 7th birthday as a kid, or remembering a fun event going to homecoming or something like that. And again, these are conscious. You have to put thought into remembering those. They don't just kind of appear out of nowhere. And these are controlled from our hippocampus. And we know hippocampus, right? If you had a hippo on campus, you'd never forget. Hippocampus has to do with processing our memories. And kind of within these divisions of long-term memory, even more specifically, are two categories that aren't really mentioned in our book, but I wanted to bring up because they are on our kind of AP curriculum guide that we should know, is retrospective and prospective memory. And we always know that if something has retro in it, it means the past. Retro, groovy, far out, yo, rad. Retro, you can think old. So it would be remembering past events, just like remembering a birthday party as a kid. Prospective memory is remembering to do something in the future. So this is something that's still in your long-term memory because it's solid in there. You have to remember it each day. but it's remembering stuff in the future. So remembering to take your medicine or remembering to turn in your homework at a certain amount of time. It's something going on in the future. So these terms come up, these little prefixes, retro and pro, and it's easy. You can just remember retro, old, pro, future. So then when we go back to here, when we're talking about using rehearsal to try and get things in our memory system so we can work on them and then hopefully put them in long-term memory, we use rehearsal, which I just said is just strategies you're using to get information into your memory system. And the two kind of ways that we're talking about this are through shallow and deep processing. Remember back to the demo I did when I split up the class? I love this unit, and I was thinking about how much I miss you guys because we had fun during this. I split up the class into two, and we had shallow processing, where the people who read something and had to memorize all the things, or you guys read the little thing and it had all the your instructions were to look at the words, think about how to pronounce them, how many letters are in them, what color they are, how difficult they are to pronounce. It was very shallow. You weren't looking at the meaning and the significance of the word and connecting it to yourself. It was just kind of looking at the surface level, like, what color is it? How many letters are there? Then the other half of the class engaged in deep processing, in which you guys were creating meaning for the words, connecting it to yourself, trying to visualize and create imagery to remember it. And obviously we saw that the half of the class that engaged in deep processing could remember all those silly associations like the slippery snake and the plump chef and all that stuff. You guys could remember that much easier because you had done all the deep processing. But the shallow processing group really struggled with this. So within these categories of let's say shallow processing is where you see the two types of rehearsal. So in shallow processing, you have maintenance rehearsal. And this is, again, it's very shallow because you're just repeating items over and over to maintain them in your short-term memory to hopefully get them into your long-term memory. But we said that this isn't the most effective way of doing it if you're trying to make like an enduring, really strong long-term memory. So an example of maintenance rehearsal would just be repeating a phone number over and over that someone gives you to remember it to dial. You guys don't have that as much because we have contacts in our phone. But if you're just trying to remember a password on a phone or a password or a Wi-Fi password or something like that, you're repeating it over and over and over. That's fine for the short term, but it's not going to create a really enduring, long-lasting memory. In deep processing, then we have elaborative rehearsal. And you can think, right, I tell you guys, elaborate, talk more. So elaborative rehearsal is obviously your more deeper, more enduring, long-lasting one. Elaborative, enduring. And this is where you're facilitating the formation of memory by linking things to what you already know. So clearly the deep processing, you're making those mnemonic devices, you're connecting it to, it's that third column in my notes where you're connecting it all to your life. And that creates a much more enduring, long-lasting memory. And that's why I have you guys do all the annoying things I have you do, because it's effective. Science and psychology and all the research tells you that. So then we have these things called effortful processing strategies. And what an effortful processing strategy is just a way to strengthen the encoding of memories into storage. So trying to create a stronger memory. And we want this, especially when we're studying for the AP exam. So this is a good review. And it's good to know kind of these titles. So if on the AP exam, maybe they asked you generally, like, talk about an effortful processing strategy. And then you're like, oh, okay, so this would be like mnemonics, chunking, hierarchies, whatever. So all these types of effortful processing strategies that we encode information with are examples of deep processing and elaborative rehearsal because it's putting meaning and thought into our information that we're processing. So an example would be mnemonics, which is just kind of coming up with those creative associations with words and tying it in with our personal life. So whether it be like creating acronyms for things or like I said, that hippo on campus, you're never going to forget it. If a hippo's on East Campus, Gary the snail with a hydro flask represents the cochlea because it's a snail-shaped part of the ear that's fluid-filled. Chunking is when you take information and split it up into little bits. Because remember, we can't fit more than 7 plus or minus things in. So if we chunk it, we can actually, extend our short-term memory capacity. So here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 things going on. And you can actually, yeah, there is 10. Guys, I'm so bad at counting that I trust myself. Okay, so you have 10 things, and that's outside of our capacity of 7 plus or minus. But when you chunk it and you split it up, 262, 560, 3100, this is school's phone number, that will be more memorable and easier to remember than if you had it all in one long strand of numbers. That's chunking, making meaningful little groups. And when we study, it's better to do it in chunks than to put it all together. So it's important and study strategy for us to do. Then we have hierarchies, which is just taking information and breaking it down into smaller bits. So kind of taking the large categories and breaking it down little by little. And this is what I do in all my little graphic organizers for you guys, right? So you can think of something like, cars. You have cars. Then you have SUV, car, truck. Then you can break it down even more into different types of truck. Ford F-150. Hierarchies going from big to small. And then another thing that helps us kind of deepen the encoding of memories is the self-reference effect. And this just says that we remember information better when it's related to ourselves. So we're kind of innately pretty selfish people, and we like to connect things to ourselves. So you're going to have a better time remembering like a celebrity's birthday if it's on your birthday. So, I remember that Meryl Streep's birthday is June 22nd because my birthday is June 22nd. If there was like a war or some big event that took place, like Michael Jackson's death or a battle in World War II, you might not be able to remember that easily. But if it happens on your birthday or happened on your anniversary or something, you'd remember it better when we connect things to ourselves. And then distributed practice. So these are two types of there's two types of strategies within these to help us study and remember information better and strengthen our memories. So the first is spacing effect. And this is what I'm trying to have you guys do by spacing out our review over, the course of 2 weeks, is studying throughout the week or the 2 weeks leading up to the AP exam rather than just cramming the night before. It's all spaced out because we know that it's better to chunk things rather than to, put it all in one thing. And then testing effect. This is when we better remember when we retrieve stuff from our long-term memory rather than just rereading it. So by actually forcing ourselves to have to pull it out rather than just, rereading it and looking at the answer key, it's making a stronger memory. So it's really good for us to kind of quiz ourselves and do practice problems, do practice FRQs on AP Classroom, and do all of those things and force yourself to really try and pull the information out rather than, doing Quizlet Learn mode rather than just, rereading stuff and looking at the answers. It's much more, it's going to create a much more enduring memory, a stronger memory. Okay, so now let's look at the brain structures involved in memory. These are all good to know, but the bolded ones are the most important, so I'll focus on those for now. Hippocampus, we said, helps process explicit memories, which are the ones that are conscious that we're thinking about. But it's not where they're stored. So left hippocampus, if you think about kind of our brain and the two hemispheres, left is verbal, and then right is more visual stuff. Cerebellum does implicit memories with classical conditioning and procedural skills because it's all about motor stuff, motor movement. And then amygdala is with strong emotionally charged memories, especially fear. which makes sense because we know all that. And that's when we talked about flashbulb memories, those really emotionally charged events like 9/11 or something like that, or for you guys when the carbon monoxide alarm went off. Now I'm coming to think that it might be a flashbulb memory when we were told that we wouldn't come back to school for coronavirus. Okay, now we're on to retrieval. So now we're talking about the actual process of pulling it out from our file cabinet, pulling out from our memory to start thinking about it again. So we stored it, and now we're taking it out. So there's 3 ways to remember to measure our retention, which is just how much we're actually able to remember things. So the first way is through recall. And remember, recall is just being able to demonstrate memory by retrieving and just pulling out the information that you learned earlier. This is an FRQ because you have to just pull it out. It's like the testing effect. There's no like little cues or multiple choice questions or things to help you recognize or remember it. You have to just do it based on your own memory of it. You have to produce it yourself. Recognition is like a multiple choice test, and that's because recognition is just being able to demonstrate your memory by identifying items previously learned. So you only have to just recognize it and point it out from a list rather than recall and just pull it out from your memory. There's recognition. You have some visual aids to try and help you remember it. So that would be like a multiple choice test. You'd be like, it would be harder to do it on FRQ, but if you have multiple choice and a couple options in front of you, you might be able to pick the correct answer out of a list. And then relearning is just the idea that we relearn things quicker the second time around. So the more you go back to relearn something, the stronger that memory is going to be, the quicker you're going to learn it. So if you learned Spanish a little bit in elementary school and then you stopped, but then you went back in high school and learned it, you still might learn it faster the second time around because there is some kind of residual memory in there. And it does show that you did have some retention of that original information because you obviously learned it again quicker than the first time. And then retrieval cues. Retrieval cues are things that help us remember better. And it's good to know kind of the overarching category and understand all these are types of retrieval cues, because on AP they could very well just say, give an example of a retrieval cue. And then you have to be like, what are those? Oh, okay, like context-dependent memory is an example. So types of retrieval cues, we have priming. And this is when an example is when you're kind of put on the spot earlier. So you're given a cue to help stimulate your memory without your conscious awareness. So typically it happens in that you're exposed to something early on, but you're not really consciously aware that there's any meaning of it or anything important with it. And then later on, you're going to be kind of put to the test to recall something. And because you were primed to something similar, you're able to better remember it. So the example here is when I had you guys fill out, or I showed you a picture of Bon Jovi is my little music of the day thing. And then later on, I had you guys play a little game and you had to fill in the blanks, and it was filling in Bon Jovi. You guys were able to do that pretty easily because you were primed to Bon Jovi. You were exposed to it kind of unconsciously, not knowing, that there was any significance to it earlier, and that allowed you to, it was a retrieval cue to help you kind of remember it better later when you put to the test. Then the next one is context-dependent memory. So this is the idea that we learn better or we remember things better when you're in the same setting as when you originally learned them. So if you might remember units 1 through 5 better when you were at school because you learned it at school. You might remember units 6 through 7 better at home because you were at home when you learned it. And then next one, these are all kind of connected here. It would be state-dependent memory. And this is that whole idea, where is it? I don't have that. There we go. Whole idea that, if you're in the same kind of state of mind or physical state of being, you remember it better if you were in that same state as when you learned it. So this is where the famous example is of drunk versus sober. So they did find that alcoholics who might have hid something when they were under the influence of alcohol would be more likely to find it when they're drunk in the same state of intoxication rather than when they're sober. But obviously, this is not encouraging anyone to go out and learn your AP Psych and get drunk and then try and recall it again, because that's not effective at all. But it does show that if you're in that same state, you could potentially remember things better if you're in the state that you learn them in. Then we have mood congruent memory. And this is kind of a part of state dependent memory. So mood congruent memory just says, it's in the name, that you remember things better if you're in the same mood as when you originally encoded and learned them. So if you were, let's say, happy when you learned it, or kind of you're more likely to remember a happy event when you're in a happy, good mood. But when you're in a sad mood, you're more likely to remember sad events. So that's what mood congruent memory is that in your current mood, you're more likely to remember events that kind of are in conjunction or in connection with that current mood. So again, when you're happy, you remember happy things. When you're sad, you remember sad things. That's why it's probably not very effective if you're trying to listen to a sad song to make you feel better or something like that. It's probably not going to be helpful because you're just going to remember more sad things. And then finally, we have the serial precision effect. And there's a couple parts with this serial precision effect, in that it has to do with the recency and primacy effect. So serial precision effect is just the overarching term that says we are more likely to remember the items that come last in a list and the items that come first in a list better. So the items that come last in a list would be the recency effect, because they're the most recent, because they came last in your list. You looked at them most recently. And then the first items in a list, primacy, because you think primary, it's the first thing that happened. So the example that I give is whenever I did a job interview, I'd always kind of put psychology in my mind a little bit. Probably wasn't making the biggest difference, but I told myself it did. That on a job interview, I'd always want to be the first one, or one of the first ones, or the last one to be on there. My other example that I gave is with The Bachelor. So when you're the bachelor and all the girls are coming out of the limos, and you're a girl in the limo, you want to be the first one coming out of the limo. Maybe you'll get the first impression rose. Or you want to be the last one coming out of the limo. You don't want to be the one in the middle, because you're going to get forgotten about. We forget about those things in the middle. Okay. Now let's move on to why we forget. So there's a whole bunch of different reasons, and let's go kind of the first big ones. So amnesia, that's a word we're kind of familiar with, right? Amnesia is just kind of that when you forget. And these are two broad categories of forgetting. Anterograde is when you can't make new memories. So this is what we had with HM and Clive Waring. When their hippocampuses were severed, we know hippocampus process new memories. So Clive and HM couldn't form new memories. So they're kind of stuck in the present. Retrograde is the inability to remember old memories. So you can't remember your childhood. You can't remember previous things in your life. Retro, old, groovy, far out. Then we have encoding failure. And encoding failure is just the idea that you can't notice what was never even encoded in the first place. So failure to process information into memory just because you didn't notice it. So maybe it kind of was in that fleeting, iconic, echoic memory, but you didn't pay attention to it, and you're not going to store it. Because I got people saying, well, why is this even one? Like, obviously, we're not going to remember it if we didn't encode it. And that's exactly it. You can't remember what you didn't encode. Then we have storage decay. And this is relating to a psychologist named Herman Ebbinghaus. So he says that he kind of came up with the forgetting curve that says initially the course of our forgetting is very rapid, and then it levels off over time. So again, you're more likely to forget things right after you learn them, but then after that initial, little bit of time passes, over the course of months, years, it's probably gonna, how much you remember is probably gonna stay relatively the same. It's just those couple initial first days where it's very rapid. And then we have the tip of the tongue phenomenon. And TOT phenomenon is just when you have something on the tip of your tongue. So it's there, like you know it, like you know someone's name, or there's like the name of a restaurant or the name of something, and you're like, oh, like I got it, I totally know it, but it's just on the tip of your tongue, you just can't get it out. That could be one reason we forget. There's just something right there that's kind of blocking it. And then this kind of connects in with these a little bit too. So that's TOT phenomenon, tip of the tongue. Then we have retrieval failures. And again, this is something where it's in there. Again, kind of like TOT phenomenon, like it's there, but there's something that's blocking it, or something that's causing you to be unable to actually retrieve it and get it out. So the first one we have would be proactive interference. And these are the ones that are really tricky for us to remember. So spend extra time with these. And just think it's kind of in the name. So we said the prefix is meaning like new or future. So proactive means that you can't remember new memories. And the reason for that is because the old ones are blocking it from being able to access it. So my example is with my stepsister, Leah. She changed her name to Talia, and I always forget to call her Talia because the old memory of her name is Leah is blocking me from that new information or new memory of her being called Leah. Then kind of the same thing as well is maybe you moved or something like that, and your old address is getting in the way of you remembering your new address. Then retroactive, remember it's in the name, so retroactive interference is when you can't remember the old things because new information is getting in the way. So an example is you changed your phone password, or you changed your computer password or your address or something like that, and now you can remember the new one really well, but you can't for the life of you remember your old password. And that's sad when I'm trying to go on Webkinz during quarantine and I can't remember my old Webkinz password. So it's the new information is preventing you from being able to access the old information, like an old password, because the new stuff is blocking your brain from accessing that. Then we have repression, and this is all about Freud. Freud says that if you have like a negative traumatizing memory, that we consciously we repress our memories. So at first it's motivated forgetting because we actually want to forget it. So we kind of force ourselves to repress it and bury them away. Then once you do that, it's buried out of your conscious awareness. So then you can no longer remember it. And then another kind of reason that we forget, sometimes it's not even so much that we forget, but rather our memories aren't perfect and they're actually quite flawed often. So we see with reconstructive memory in Elizabeth Loftus that often we misremember the information. And this is due to schemas in our top-down processing, and that sometimes with the misinformation effect, we could have leading questions and things that might alter our memory of an event because we're given kind of misleading information about it. Someone might tell us an incorrect fact and then we alter our memory of it. So our memories aren't, perfect. They're not saved final. What we remember is kind of taking in other information that might have happened after that event. And then source amnesia, which is where, this is my example with my cousin. Um, source amnesia is when you can remember, you have a memory, but you actually have it with the wrong source. So you're misattributing where it's coming from. So this happens a lot when artists accidentally plagiarize something without knowing. So, let's say like Justin Bieber came up with a new song and he releases it, and then someone like Tom Petty or, well, R.I.P. Tom Petty, so some other celebrity is like, hey, that's my song. I think this actually happened with Sam Smith and Tom Petty. So Sam Smith, really thought it was his own and had source amnesia, really thinking that like this was mine, but he actually had like heard the lyrics or heard the rhythm and stuff like that before, but couldn't remember where he heard it from and actually thought it was his. Or another example would be your little sibling. They You might have heard a story about them when they were little, and then you actually think that it happened to you, but really it happened to them. So it's a memory that's out there, like something that actually happened. You just have the wrong source. Or another example, again, is you're reading a book as a child, like a little storybook or something, and then you read it a bunch and you actually think that the story happened to you, but obviously it didn't. It's a real memory out there. You just have the wrong source of where it came from. And that's what happened when my cousin had her little baby picture, in which she posted on Instagram saying Throwback Thursday to when I was a little baby, but turns out it wasn't her. It was the frame stock photo that my aunt put in her room, and she didn't realize that it wasn't her. She had source amnesia. Obviously, it's a baby, but it wasn't the correct source of where it came from. It wasn't her. Okay, so now on to thinking and decision making. So we have the two kind of ways that we process information, which is top down, going from our past experiences as memories, which is kind of the quick, easy way. And then we have bottom up, which is our more thought out, longer, slow but steady wins the race type of thinking. So heuristic is just a mental shortcut or rule of thumb of how to do something. It generates a quicker answer and is usually correct, but sometimes isn't. It's more like a guesstimate. So this is what kind of can cause cognitive biases sometimes. Then algorithm is precise. It's a specific set of instructions for solving a problem or completing a process. And it's foolproof. It's always going to give you the correct answer if you apply the algorithm correctly. So it's like a recipe. It's like using the math formula. If you do it correctly, it's going to get you the correct answer. But obviously, doing the quadratic formula takes much longer than doing a guess and check method. So an example here is you lost your keys. You're going to use heuristics first by just looking in the last place you found them. That's a good rule of thumb to find them. But if that doesn't work, then you're going to have to use an algorithm in which you look at, retrace your steps and look at every single place that it could possibly be. So now let's go into cognitive biases and heuristics. So we said that cognitive biases kind of are a heuristic that's become permanent and enduring. And sometimes these are issues. It's when we use those shortcuts in thinking to try and process information because our brain wants to be really efficient. And we use that top-down processing, but sometimes it results in a bias in which it kind of creates a negative impact on our thinking and processing of information. So up first, we have confirmation bias. And this is when you're only seeking out information that already confirms your pre-existing beliefs. And the best example I give of this one is like politics and watching the news, especially with like impeachment. So if you're someone who, is a Republican and support President Trump, during the impeachment, you might seek out sources that confirm, I really like him and he's a great dude. If you're someone who is a Democrat and dislikes President Trump, you're going to be seeking out sources that says, yeah, he's terrible, like he should be impeached, I want him out. So that is an example of confirmation bias. You're not going to be looking like across the aisle at different sources. You're only going to be looking at news articles that confirms your already held beliefs. Another example I said was with the conspiracy theories, like the Beatles one. Uh, if you're not looking for clues and things to support your conspiracy theory of like Paul is dead, uh, you wouldn't notice all these weird little things like backmasking the music and the little clues. But once I told you about them, then you heard it because you were looking for it and seeking out information to confirm your belief that Paul McCartney is dead. We also see confirmation bias at play in experiments. So that could be on a research methods question with experimenter bias, and that if a researcher really believes that their hypothesis is correct, they might only look for things that are supporting their hypothesis and ignore things that are you disproving it. Availability heuristic. This is when you think an event is more likely because you've been exposed to it recently and it comes to mind more easily. So I said the example here is when you think the world is more violent than it actually is because you're constantly seeing headlines in the news saying, all these that violence is up and et cetera, that there's all this shooting going on. But it turns out that in reality, violence has gone down over the years. It's just because we're seeing these headlines, we think that it's worse than it is. The other example is like here, if you were exposed to like media headlines saying, or you watched Jaws or something before going to the beach, that's what's available in your most recently in your mind. So then you go to the beach and you're like, oh, I'm going to die from a shark because that's what's most accessible and available in your mind. I had ignorantly said coronavirus was an example of availability heuristic and that everyone was freaking out about dying from the virus because we're exposed to all the media headlines. And obviously now I was thinking about this the other day. I'm like, wow, that was really bad of me to say. Like, obviously, I didn't know the extent to what was going to happen. And that was a very poor example on my part. So I just want to apologize for that one because obviously that wasn't in the case of what happened because we know that things have been much more serious, unfortunately. Next up, we have representativeness heuristic. And this is when you categorize a situation based on a pattern of previous experiences or beliefs about a scenario. So this is where stereotypes could potentially be at play because you're using your prototypes or your like mental best fit image of a category to kind of base your thoughts. So again, this is just a shortcut. So what your general thoughts are on a group of people. So an example would be you meet someone who's a librarian and you're assuming that they're shy and bookish because your prototype, your kind of mental best image of librarian is that, typical quiet, bookish type person who's going to tell you to shh in the library. And that's where stereotypes come at play, of course, because if your prototype of, say, like, someone with tattoos is that they're tough and up to no good, that's going to create a stereotype about a group of people. And obviously that's not true. So that's representativeness heuristic. When you see things that kind of seem stereotypy, that would be kind of representativeness heuristic. Overconfidence is when we overestimate the accuracy of our knowledge and judgment. So, we are much more confident in ourselves than we should be. So an example of this is that, you're driving across the country on a road trip and you think you don't need a map because you're like, I know the way, but you end up needing a map. So you kind of overestimated how accurate your knowledge and judgments were in that scenario. So now on to creativity. And this all still kind of falls under that realm of thinking, decision making, and that part of cognition. So creativity is the ability to produce novel and valuable ideas. Remember, we said it's not just being artistic, it's being able to think about problems differently and be a problem solver. You could be creative as an artist by, producing different works of arts, but you also could be creative as an accountant if you're coming up with different ways to, solve problems and do taxes or whatever. It's just creating new ideas and solving things in different ways. So within creativity, there's two types of thinking. So there's convergent thinking, which is kind of what school teaches us, that it's thinking pointed towards one solution. So saying there's kind of only one solution to a problem, right? We're learning this with multiple choice, with tests that, there's only one right answer. But in reality, often there's multiple ways of doing things and multiple right answers. So convergent thinking is like your paint by number. You have to do it this way, or multiple choice. Divergent thinking, you can think it's diverging. There's multiple solutions. There's multiple answers. It's diverging from the norm. Divergent thinking is just thinking that searches for multiple possible answers to a question. So this would be painting outside the lines or mixing your own colors. You're saying that there's multiple ways to solve a problem or multiple solutions. So I gave the example, my friend Anna, who had to do one of those paint and sip classes that she didn't want to go to. It was for like a friend's birthday or something. And they were all supposed to make the little painting that they teach you, and everyone makes the same one, and yay. And Anna was like, nah, I don't want to be convergent thinking and have to do the one correct painting. I'm gonna do my own thing. And she was a divergent thinker and thought outside the box and made her own painting of a little llama on a pink moon. So that would be divergent thinking. And one issue that comes up with problem solving is often because we are trained to be convergent thinkers in school is something called rigidity or a mental set. And mental set is when you respond to a new problem in the same manner that you used for a previous problem. So we think just because it worked for the last time we encountered this problem, it's going to work for every single time after that. And this kind of is bad because it prevents you from seeing a novel or a different situation or solution to a problem. So my example of a mental set, I said, my example of a mental set, if I can, now I'm drawing on this. My example of a mental set was my TV in my classroom always breaks. How much I missed that. And last time it was because of the HDMI cord being all messed up. So, of course, I immediately assumed that the next time it breaks is due to the HDMI cord, and I do all this stuff to fix that. But this time it was actually just that the speakers weren't turned on. So it was very obvious and in my face, but because I was solving it in the previous way that I had done it, I didn't even see that. So it prevented me from seeing a novel solution. Then the next one is functional fixedness. And this is our inability to see a new use for an object. And this is something that, is, again, because of our trained as convergent thinkers. So remember back to when we did those little infomercials and you guys had to find new use for a tape dispenser, find new use for a stapler, for a different things in my classroom. Typically, we only see one use for an item or object because we're convergent thinkers. But functional fixedness is when we get stuck and we can't see the new uses for these objects. And children are less likely to have this because children are always so imaginative, so they can see different uses for an object. So the example I gave too was this guy who uses ramen noodles to fix everything. Obviously, he's found a lot of different functions for ramen noodles. So he is beating and overcoming functional fixedness. And I briefly mentioned this already, but two things that come up in our thinking are concepts and prototypes. And this is the precursor to schema, which I'll cover more in the developmental review. A concept is like our mental representation of categories. So kind of like our file cabinets on different things like objects, events, people, sports teams, colleges, dogs, whatever. just our metal filing cabinets or little files on different categories. And then prototype is like your best image or best example of that concept or category. So we played Family Feud in class that one day, and we said a prototype example is like when you're trying to play Family Feud and you're trying to come up with, survey says what most people would come up for the category. So example is when you think of sports team, what do you think of? Packers is your prototype. Brewers is your prototype. Bucks is your prototype. When you think of college, what's your prototype? Madison. Harvard is like the big one for everyone in the United States. Dog, lab, golden retriever. So it's kind of your mental best image or kind of quintessential image of a certain category. And we said again that sometimes those prototypes can lead to that representativeness heuristic and stereotypes. When you say, your mental quintessential image of someone with tattoos is like a gangster bad person or something like that. On to our final category of intelligence. So, definition of intelligence is just the mental quality consisting of the ability to learn from experience, solve problems, and use knowledge to adapt to new situations. So remember, we said that the whole controversy comes in that people are defining intelligence differently. And the question of like what constitutes intelligence? Would something like art and music be a part of our intelligence, or is it more things like on an IQ test? So we do come to see that people like Howard Gardner are going to include multiple different types. So controversy is intelligence one thing, like one general overarching ability of if you're good at math, you're probably going to be good at English, or can you be an intelligent in different subjects like Howard Gardner says. So Charles Spearman has that idea of general intelligence marked by that little g, and he says that we have one general intelligence that determines our abilities in a range of different areas. And this is where you use factor analysis, and it's that kind of like statistical technique in which you see kind of clumps in different categories. So in looking at factor analysis, he found that this idea of general intelligence, that if you're doing well in one area on an IQ test, generally you can see that it's correlated with you doing well in these other areas. So if you're doing well in spatial awareness, you're probably doing well in mathematical analysis and verbal, linguistic, whatever. So he says that we have intelligence is just one general ability, and that generally like our IQ score kind of dictates how we fall in most kind of categories. So big thing is intelligence is one general ability, one thing that kind of determines how we do in a range of skills. And he didn't see things like music and art as being a part of general intelligence, because his view of intelligence was what's on an IQ test. So music, art, things like that aren't measured on an IQ test, so he didn't really even see those as being a part of our intelligence. Then Howard Gardner comes up and says, no. Our intelligence is many different things. You could be intelligent in one area and then not intelligent in another, but still, have intelligence. So he's saying he identifies 8 different types of intelligence. So you can see here, might be good to know some of them. So he has visuospatial, linguistic, verbal. Intrapersonal is like knowing oneself. Interpersonal is working with others. So all these different types. And again, you could be intelligent in one and then not as strong in another, but still be considered intelligent. And he used savants as evidence in this, because if you were a savant, it meant that you were really, really like genius level intelligent in one very specific thing. But this was often correlated with someone who has maybe something like autism, in which you might have deficits in other areas. So if you're someone who's like Kim Peek, who's a genius and has memorized like every book in a library and could spit out any fact, He's saying, how could you say that these people are not intelligent, Mr. Spearman? Obviously, these people are intelligent in their own way, and that's why there's multiple different types of intelligence rather than just one general ability. Like Kim Peek couldn't, get dressed and brush his teeth on his own, but he knew every book and every fact there was. So multiple different types. Then Sternberg's kind of a compromise. So he's still thinking that there's multiple types of intelligence, but he narrows it down to 3. And these I remember by the acronym of ACP. You have analytical, which is kind of your school smarts, and kind of convergent thinking. So it would kind of fall under that category of like logical, mathematical, and kind of linguistic verbal of Gardner's. So very much your kind of analytical skills that you'd see in school. Then you have creative, and this is more of your divergent thinking, which is that thinking outside of the box, creating new ideas, and coming up with multiple different ways to approach a problem and come up with a solution. And then you have practical, and this is your street smarts. If you haven't watched John Mulaney yet, since you've been on quarantine, watch him. He's funny, and he talks about street smarts. So this isn't even just street smarts and like knowing how to, navigate a neighborhood or things like that. It could also be applied in your workplace. So knowing how to work with people, problem solve in your office, and things like that. So just kind of your everyday life skills that help you be successful. So he comes up with those 3. And then our important psychologists and intelligence assessments. We have Alfred Binet, and he created the Binet-Simon intelligence test. And this is the original one from France. And it determines a person's mental age. And we know that this wasn't originally supposed to be used to determine your overall intelligence. It was just kind of to help students get placed in correct classroom settings for school. So he didn't intend for it to be this whole huge thing to say our actual intelligence. But then what happens is Louis Terman, he takes Binet's test and applies it to the United States. And he is at Stanford, so he creates it and calls it the Stanford-Binet Intelligence Test. And this is what becomes our IQ score. And we know that IQ is calculated by taking your mental age and dividing it by your chronological age and timesing it by 100. And then David Wishler, he created the Wishler Adult Intelligence Test, WAIS, and this now is the most commonly used one, and it has 15 subtests that has a verbal and a performance component. So it's a little more comprehensive than a standard IQ test, like the Binet-Simon one. It has a little bit more categories, so hopefully tries to gauge more aspects of your intelligence. Now, another person in there is Francis Galton. He's bad. That's why he's in gray on the bottom. He took these intelligence tests, like the Binet and Stanford Binet one, and he used it for eugenics purposes to prove the superiority of the white race. So he's a person to know because he was bad. And obviously, let me go back here and say, eugenics is a pseudoscience. It's not an actual science. So everything he was doing was inaccurate, and it wasn't actually proving the superiority of the white race. He just attempted to use it for this purpose. And then, so now when we look at different types of intelligence assessments, we have to look at reliability versus validity. If something is reliable, we know it's consistent. So you should be getting the same score each time, around the same score each time you take it. So this is an example of you're taking the ACT multiple times and you're getting around the same score. Other things could be confounding variables in the amount of studying you're doing and if you have a tutor or not. But that would be reliability. Validity is that the test is actually testing what it's supposed to test. So the example is the ACT is supposed to be a measure of your college readiness and if you're going to be successful at the college level or not. Is the ACT actually assessing this? My personal belief is no, it's not a valid test. I think that you could be successful at a college level and not have the best ACT score. So that's the example here. And then two forms of intelligence tests are the aptitude test and the achievement test. An aptitude test is a test that's designed to predict a person's future performance. So this is like the ACT, SAT, and it's predicting your ability to learn. It's not assessing what you know, it's assessing your ability to be able to learn in the future. So the ACT assesses if you'll be able to learn at the college level and be successful. Achievement is a test that assesses what a person has already learned. It's assessing the content that you know. So this would be like a test in school for a specific subject. And the perfect example is our AP Psych exam. It's assessing how much you've learned and how much content you know. That's an achievement exam. One good term to note in relation to intelligence testing is the Flynn effect. And this is just what we said is the idea that performance on, it's a phenomenon that performance on IQ scores has steadily increased over generations. We don't know the exact cause, but it could be, increase in technology, increase in access to schooling, reduction of malnutrition across the world. So just across the board, IQ scores have been steadily rising over generations across the world. And then two types of intelligence. These ones come up on AP exams from time to time, so good ones to know on FRQs would be fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence. Fluid intelligence is your ability to reason quickly, pick up new information, solve abstract problems. The big thing here, I would say, is picking up new information. And this is one that decreases as adults age. So us younger people are better at this. And the perfect example is computer skills. How many of you guys have tried to teach your parents or grandparents how to Zoom or FaceTime over this quarantine? They don't do a good job at it, I will tell you. There's many good examples of that. So that's a perfect example. Crystallized intelligence is using knowledge accumulated over time and verbal skills. So it's very much kind of like vocab, facts, and things like that. And this increases over time. So as you get older, your crystallized intelligence improves. So this makes sense because think of all your grandparents or whoever. They like to do little crossword puzzles. They like to play like little Sudoku and things like that. It's because their crystallized, factual kind of trivia, vocab knowledge increases as they age. And then finally, one last term. This one I hadn't addressed before, but I want to bring it up. I was going to save it for our social psych unit because I think it fits better, but this is something that could potentially be fair game on the AP exam. And this is a term called stereotype threat. The stereotype threat that says that if you're at risk for confirming a negative stereotype about a group that you're a part of, it could be racial, ethnic, religion, gender, then you might actually perform worse on your exam. So an example here is Steele and Aronson are two psychologists who did a really important study on this that I will emphasize much more in our social psych unit. But what they found with stereotype threat is that when you're in a category that's inducing stereotype threat, so if you were given a test and you were asked to note what your race, gender, religion, whatever is, when you feel like you're kind of being evaluated on the basis of your the group that you're a part of, and that you could potentially be letting your group down based on your performance, you're going to do much more poorly as a result. So in their research, they put kind of a group together that was asked to indicate their race or gender before the test, and then they were also put in a condition where it was kind of a high stakes one where it said this is a measure of your aptitude or intelligence or something like that. So in that group, the people, this would be African Americans, performed much worse when they were in the stereotype threat condition, whereas when they were not in the stereotype threat condition, the scores were much more even. And then this is one with gender. So you see women performed much worse when they were in stereotype threat conditions than when they weren't. So once they remove that, you actually see girls are outperforming the men. So this is an example of stereotype threat is again when you're kind of asked to indicate your group membership on an exam, and when it's kind of a high stakes test that's a measure of your intelligence or ability, you often perform worse on that. That's what stereotype threat is saying. So that was a whopping amount of cognitive psychology in one lesson. So if you stuck through that, like, bravo, way to go. I just put these here just in case you want clarification on different items. So yeah, if you have any questions on some of this stuff, again, cognitive psychology is probably the biggest portion that's on, biggest unit that's on the AP exam. So it's a good one to really put some time into studying for.